When the phone rang, her voice sounded gentle. "Hey, honey, you're at home, right? I just wanted to make sure everything's okay." But what she didn't know was that I was right behind them, quietly observing every gesture, every whispered word between her and the man she once called just a colleague. My heart exploded, not from what I heard, but from what I saw. Her gaze, those secretive smiles, and his hand lingering far too close for it to be innocent. But before diving into the story, let me know where you're watching this from in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on future stories. Chris gripped the steering wheel, his fingers tight against the worn leather. The hum of the engine filled the car, a steady rhythm that matched the pounding in his head after a grueling day at work. He stole a glance at Lisa, seated beside him, scrolling casually on her phone. Her cheerful energy stood in stark contrast to his weariness. All Chris wanted was to get home, kick off his shoes, and sink into the couch. Lisa broke the silence, her tone light and teasing. "Hey Chris, guess what? A bunch of us are meeting at McKinley's tonight. You know, the bar near the office? Let's stop by. Just for a little bit." Chris sighed, his exhaustion evident in his voice. "Lisa, I'm exhausted. Can't we just go home?" Lisa's smile didn't waver. She turned slightly to face him, her voice taking on a persuasive tone. "Oh, come on. You're always too tired. It's just for a little while. Everyone's asking about you. They miss seeing you." Her words made Chris frown. He didn't know Lisa's coworkers well and wasn't sure why they'd miss him. "Your friends miss seeing me?" he asked, the skepticism clear in his voice. Lisa laughed, brushing off his tone. Of course. Don't be a party pooper." Chris sighed again, this time heavier. He could tell by her tone and the sparkle in her eyes that she wouldn't take no for an answer. Lisa's social butterfly nature had always been a point of difference between them. She thrived in the noise and energy of people, while Chris found solace in quiet, familiar spaces. But as much as he didn't want to go, he hated disappointing her even more. "Fine," he muttered reluctantly, his eyes fixed on the road. "But not for long." Lisa's grin widened and she gave his arm a playful squeeze. "You're the best, babe. I promise, just for a little while." Chris didn't reply. He focused on the road ahead, the headlights cutting through the early evening darkness. A faint pit formed in his stomach, a mix of dread and resignation. Tonight wasn't going to be the peaceful evening he had hoped for, and deep down, he already knew he'd regret it. The bar was alive with noise and energy as Chris and Lisa stepped through the entrance. Warm light reflected off rows of glasses behind the bar, while the scent of fried food and beer hung heavy in the air. The hum of conversation mixed with bursts of laughter, creating a cacophony that made Chris instinctively tighten his grip on Lisa's hand. This wasn't his scene. Not after a long day. Not ever. But he was here, and that was enough. Lisa, on the other hand, lit up immediately. She waved to a table near the corner where a group of her co-workers had already gathered. Without hesitation, she tugged Chris along, her enthusiasm nearly dragging him through the crowd. The group noticed them before they reached the table, and a cheer went up that made Chris cringe inwardly. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," Katie, one of Lisa's more outspoken friends, called out. Her grin was wide, her tone playful but laced with a sharpness that made Chris uneasy. "Did Lisa have to drag you out of the house again?" Chris shifted uncomfortably, his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets. "Something like that," he muttered, his voice low enough that only Lisa, standing closest to him, caught it. Katie laughed, her voice carrying over the noise. "Typical," she said with a shake of her head, her teasing clearly meant for the rest of the group's benefit, as much as Chris himself. Darren opened his eyes to look at her, the feline cat beginning to purr, a wonderful fur capturing the beauty of. Lisa joined in, a soft laugh escaping her lips as she nudged Chris lightly with her elbow. "Patience," she said, her eyes sparkling as she exchanged a knowing glance with Katie. The group at the table chuckled, some already turning back to their drinks and conversations. Chris felt his shoulders tighten. the noise and attention pressing in on him from all sides. Lisa had always been comfortable in moments like these, moving seamlessly between friends and acquaintances, her laughter as effortless as her charm. Chris, however, felt like an outsider, an intruder, even. In her world, he pulled out a chair and sat down, wishing he could shrink into the background. The group's energy swirled around him as Lisa leaned into the conversation with ease, catching up with her friends like she belonged here. Chris tried to focus on the beer someone had slid in front of him, the condensation dampening his palm as he gripped it tightly. The noise and banter rolled on, leaving him to wonder, not for the first time, why he had agreed to this. As the conversation around the table picked up, Chris tried to blend into the background, sipping his beer and nodding politely when spoken to. He'd been to a few of these gatherings before, and they always left him feeling out of place. Lisa's friends were a loud, opinionated bunch, their jokes often towing the line between playful and mean-spirited. Tonight, unfortunately, seemed no different. It started casually enough, with Mark, a tall, boisterous guy in a polo shirt, turning to Chris with a smirk. "Still crunching numbers all day?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. "Must be thrilling." Chris managed a half-hearted smile, unsure how to respond. "It's work," he said flatly, hoping the topic would change. Katie jumped in, her tone dripping with mock concern. "How do you even stay awake at work? Or is that why you're always too tired to go out?" The group erupted into laughter, and Chris felt a flush creep up his neck. He glanced at Lisa, silently hoping she'd step in. But she was laughing right along with them. "Oh, don't feel bad for him," Lisa said, her voice carrying over the noise. "Chris has mastered the art of looking busy while doing the bare minimum." While people fussed, Lisa gazed at the color drain from her. The laughter grew louder. Chris's jaw tightened as he stared at his beer, avoiding eye contact. A sharp pang of humiliation settled in his chest, but he stayed silent, willing himself to let it pass. He told himself they didn't mean any harm, that this was just their sense of humor. Still, the words stung. Mark raised his glass, his grin widening. "Lisa, how do you put up with him?" he asked, his voice loud enough to draw attention from a few nearby tables. Lisa smirked, clearly enjoying the spotlight. "Patience," she quipped, earning another round of laughter. She lifted her own glass, her smile almost mischievous, to Chris, the man who somehow makes being boring look like an art form. The group toasted, clinking their glasses together while Chris sat frozen. His chest tightened, the heat of embarrassment now mixed with simmering anger. He forced himself to take a slow breath, but it didn't help. The room felt smaller, the laughter sharper, cutting into him like tiny blades. Without a word, Chris pushed back his chair and stood abruptly. The sudden motion caused a pause in the conversation, a few heads turning his way. "I need some air," he muttered, his voice tight. Lisa barely glanced at him, waving dismissively as she took another sip of her drink. "Don't be so sensitive. We're just joking," she called after him, her tone light, as if she hadn't noticed the shift in his demeanor. Chris didn't reply. He weaved through the crowded bar, his fists clenched and his thoughts racing. Once outside, the cool night air hit him, but it did little to calm the storm brewing inside. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to acknowledge the truth. He didn't just feel out of place. He felt disrespected. By Lisa. By her friends. By all of it. Chris leaned against the cold brick wall of the bar, his breath forming faint clouds in the crisp night air. The distant murmur of traffic and the occasional burst of laughter from inside McKinley's only heightened his sense of isolation. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to push down the anger bubbling in his chest. The humiliation from moments earlier still clung to him, a sharp ache that wouldn't subside. He stared out at the parking lot, the faint glow of streetlights casting long shadows. He felt stuck, caught between his growing resentment and the nagging voice in his head telling him to let it go, that it wasn't worth making a scene. But the laughter, Lisa's laughter, replayed in his mind like an echo he couldn't escape. As he stood there, his phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He hesitated before pulling it out, already knowing who it was. Lisa's name flashed across the screen, the ringtone cutting sharply through the quiet. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, letting it ring out as a small act of defiance. But something compelled him to answer. "Chris?" Lisa's voice came through the line, soft and sweet, the way she always spoke when she was trying to win him over. "I love you, okay? Come back inside. I'll make it up to you." Chris's grip tightened on the phone, his jaw clenching. He felt the weight of her words, the way they were meant to disarm him, to pull him back into her orbit. Her tone was calculated, carefully balanced between affection and coaxing, as if she knew exactly how far she could push him before he'd walk away. He stared out into the dark street, the faint buzz of a street lamp matching the low hum of irritation still simmering beneath his skin. He could hear the noise from the bar, the faint sound of Lisa's friends still laughing and carrying on as if nothing had happened. As if his presence or absence made no difference at all. "Sure," he said finally, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He didn't know why he agreed. Maybe it was easier to avoid the inevitable argument, or maybe he just didn't have the energy to fight her right now. Either way, the word hung in the air, heavy with resignation. Lisa's tone brightened instantly. "Great! Come on, babe, it'll be fine. I'll make sure they ease up, I promise." Chris didn't reply. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and stared at the door to the bar, the muffled sounds of music and conversation calling him back to a place he didn't want to be. With a deep breath, he steeled himself and headed toward the entrance, already regretting the decision. Chris pushed the door open, the lively hum of the bar enveloping him once more. The sound grated against his nerves, every laugh and clink of a glass pulling at the tension in his chest. He scanned the room, his gaze locking on the table where Lisa and her friends sat. The sight that greeted him froze him mid-step. Lisa was leaned in close to Ryan, one of her coworkers he'd met briefly in passing. The way they sat, their shoulders nearly touching, spoke of a familiarity that immediately set Chris's teeth on edge. Then he noticed Ryan's hand, a movement subtle enough to go unnoticed in the dimly lit bar, but unmistakable to Chris. Ryan's hand rested under the table, too close to Lisa's thigh, lingering in a way that turned Chris's stomach. For a second, Chris thought he might be imagining it, but Lisa didn't flinch or move away. Instead, she tilted her head, laughing softly at something Ryan said, her body language betraying a comfort that cut deeper than any insult her friends had thrown at him earlier. Chris's chest tightened, the air in the room suddenly feeling thick and stifling. Before he could stop himself, the fury that had been simmering all night boiled over. He strode forward, his movements quick and deliberate. His voice, sharp and loud, pierced through the chatter around them. "What the hell, Lisa?" The sound of the words silenced the table, heads turning as Chris grabbed the edge of a nearby table and flipped it in one swift motion. The crash of glasses and the clatter of silverware startled everyone, the room falling into a tense hush. Lisa's eyes widened in shock, her face paling as she saw the look in Chris's eyes. Ryan, frozen in his seat, looked up at him, his complexion draining of color. Chris turned his glare on Ryan, his voice a low growl as he pointed a finger at him. "Get your damn hands off my wife." Ryan stumbled to his feet, holding his hands up defensively. "Hey man, calm down." The other, "Don't say another word," Chris snapped, his voice rising with the kind of authority that made Ryan flinch. His fists clenched at his sides, barely restraining himself from doing something he might regret. Lisa's voice broke through the tension, shaky and pleading. "Chris, please, let me explain." Chris turned to her, the betrayal written across his face. He didn't want to hear it. Not now, not ever. Without another word, he grabbed her wrist, his grip firm but not harsh. "Get in the car," he said, his voice cold and unyielding. Lisa hesitated for a moment, her gaze darting between Chris and Ryan. But the weight of his stare left her no room to argue. She rose silently, her head low, and followed him toward the door. The silence of the crowd followed them, whispers buzzing in their wake. As they stepped outside, Chris's fury remained palpable, the night air doing little to cool the storm that raged within him. The car door slammed shut with a force that echoed in the night. Chris gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The engine roared to life, but the tension inside the vehicle was deafening. Neither of them spoke as Chris pulled out of the parking lot, his jaw clenched and his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Lisa sat rigidly in the passenger seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She stole a glance at Chris, her heart pounding as she tried to gauge his mood, though his expression left little to the imagination. The anger radiating from him was almost tangible, filling the confined space of the car like a storm cloud. The silence stretched on, oppressive and stifling. Lisa opened her mouth to speak, her voice hesitant as she broke the stillness. "Chris, listen." "Shut up," Chris snapped, his tone sharp and final, cutting her words off like a blade. His voice didn't rise, but the weight of it made her flinch, and she immediately fell silent. He didn't look at her, his eyes remaining locked on the dark road ahead, but his grip on the wheel tightened even further, his anger seeping through every tense line of his body. Lisa's lips trembled, and she turned her gaze toward the window, watching the city lights blur past. She wanted to explain, to say something, anything, that could justify what had happened, but she knew there was no excuse, nothing she could say to calm the rage simmering beneath Chris's controlled exterior. The hum of the tires against the asphalt was the only sound as they sped down the empty streets. Chris's mind raced, replaying the scene in the bar over and over. Every detail was burned into his memory. Ryan's smug proximity, Lisa's laughter, her refusal to pull away. He couldn't reconcile the woman sitting beside him now with the one he'd seen back there. His chest felt heavy, a mix of anger and betrayal constricting his breath. Lisa shifted slightly in her seat, but she didn't dare speak again. The atmosphere was suffocating, and she could feel the weight of Chris's fury pressing down on her, leaving her frozen and helpless. The silence persisted, a chasm widening between them with every passing mile. Chris didn't trust himself to speak. He was afraid of what might come out if he did, afraid he might say something he couldn't take back. So he stayed quiet, his focus fixed on the road, his thoughts a turbulent mess of anger, pain, and disbelief. The only certainty he had was that things between them would never be the same. The front door creaked open, and Chris stepped inside without bothering to switch on the lights. The darkness matched the mood that had clung to him since they'd left the bar. Lisa followed hesitantly, her footsteps soft and measured. She lingered near the entrance, as if unsure whether to stay or leave. Chris moved to the kitchen, his movements sharp and deliberate. He slammed his keys onto the counter, the sound echoing through the quiet house. Lisa opened her mouth to say something, but before she could, Chris pulled his phone from his pocket and began scrolling. His face was illuminated by the pale glow of the screen, his expression hardening with every swipe. "Chris?" Lisa tried, her voice trembling, but he cut her off with a single look, his eyes blazing with anger. She shrank back, her arms folding tightly across her chest. After a moment, he turned the screen toward her, his hand shaking from suppressed rage. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice low but seething. The words were like a crack of thunder, shattering the tense silence between them. Lisa's breath hitched as she looked at the screen. Her face went pale as her worst fears were confirmed. There, staring back at her, were the messages. The flirty exchanges, the emojis, the photos. Her lips parted, but no words came out. "Chris, I can explain," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Chris let out a sharp, bitter laugh, his hand dropping to his side as he shook his head. "Explain this?" he shot back, his voice rising. 2 months, Lisa, 2 months of this. behind my back while I was at work, paying the bills, thinking everything was fine? Lisa's eyes welled up with tears, and she took a step forward, reaching out toward him. "It's not what you think," she cried, her voice cracking. "Ryan and it's not serious. It didn't mean anything." Chris's glare intensified, and he stepped back, putting distance between them. "Not serious?" he repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief and contempt. He held the phone up again, scrolling through the messages as if to remind himself they were real. "These messages read like a damn love story. Last night was incredible. You make me feel so alive. What part of this doesn't mean anything, Lisa?" Tears streamed down Lisa's face as she clasped her hands together, her voice desperate. "Chris, please. It was a mistake. I wasn't thinking. I didn't mean to hurt you." Chris's bitter laugh returned, harsher this time. He tossed the phone onto the table, the sound making Lisa flinch. "A mistake?" he spat. "Mistakes are accidents, Lisa. You don't accidentally text someone, meet up with them, and hide it from your husband for 2 months. Lisa's sobs grew louder, but Chris didn't soften. The betrayal had carved too deep a wound, and every word she said only twisted the knife. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he continued, his voice breaking. "You didn't just hurt me. You destroyed us. You broke every ounce of trust I had in you." Lisa fell silent, her head bowed as her tears dripped onto the floor. Chris stood there, his breathing heavy, his chest heaving from the weight of his anger. The silence that followed was deafening, filled only with the sound of Lisa's quiet sobs and Chris's labored breaths. Finally, he shook his head, his voice quieter but no less resolute. "I don't even know who you are anymore, Lisa." He turned away, unable to look at her any longer, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on him like a crushing force. Chris stormed into the bedroom, his movements sharp and deliberate, his anger burning hotter with each passing second. He yanked open the closet doors, grabbed an armful of Lisa's clothes and threw them onto the bed without a word. His face was a mask of cold determination, his jaw set like stone as he moved with purpose. Lisa followed behind him, her voice trembling as she tried to reason with him. "Chris, please, can we just talk? You're being irrational." Chris ignored her, pulling open drawers and dumping their contents into a duffel bag he found in the corner. Shoes, sweaters, and makeup bags were tossed haphazardly into the pile as Lisa stood frozen in the doorway, her hands pressed to her chest. Finally, she found her voice, desperation creeping into her tone. "Chris, stop," she cried. "You're being crazy." In that, Chris froze, his back stiffening. Slowly, he turned to face her, his eyes cold and sharp as ice. "Crazy?" he repeated, his voice low and deadly calm. "Crazy is cheating on your husband for months and thinking he wouldn't find out. Crazy is making a fool of me while I worked my ass off to give us a life. That's crazy, Lisa." His words struck her like a slap, her face crumpling as tears streamed freely down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "It was a mistake. A terrible mistake. Please, Chris, don't do this." Chris didn't respond. He zipped up the duffel bag with a sharp tug and threw it over his shoulder before heading for the front door. Lisa followed him, her cries growing louder, her pleas more desperate. "Chris, please, I love you. We can fix this. We can work through it. Just give me a chance to make it right." Chris dropped the bag on the lawn, the sound of it hitting the ground punctuating the moment. He turned back toward the house, his expression unreadable as he moved to grab more of her belongings. Lisa grabbed his arm, her fingers trembling as they clung to his sleeve. "Don't do this," she begged, her voice cracking. "Please, Chris, you're angry. I understand. But we can fix this. I'll do anything." He pulled her close, savoring the firm scent of her, and took a deep breath. He pulled his arm free with a sharp jerk, his gaze piercing as he stared her down. "Fix this," he repeated bitterly. "There's no fixing this, Lisa. You don't come back from something like this." Lisa collapsed onto the porch, her sobs echoing into the quiet night. Chris stood over her, his voice cold and final. "Get out of my house," he said, pointing to the open door. She shook her head, her tears pooling on the ground beneath her. "Please, Chris, don't do this. I love you." Chris's expression didn't waver. He pointed again, his voice firm. "Out. Now." Lisa looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, searching for even the smallest trace of forgiveness, but she found none. With a final, trembling breath, she rose to her feet, gathered what she could carry, and stepped off the porch. Chris didn't watch her go. He stood rooted in place, staring at the door frame, the weight of finality settling over him like a heavy stone. The next morning, Chris sat in his car outside a nondescript office building, the name Caldwell & Associates etched on a bronze plaque near the entrance. He stared at it for a moment, the reality of the situation sinking in. This was not where he had ever envisioned himself, seeking legal help to end his marriage. But the betrayal he had uncovered left him with no choice. He couldn't let Lisa's actions go unanswered. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and walked into the office. The receptionist greeted him warmly, her cheerful demeanor at odds with the heavy burden he carried. After a brief exchange, she led him into a private office, where Nathan Caldwell, a man in his late 40s with a sharp suit and an even sharper demeanor, stood to greet him. "Mr. Carter," Caldwell said, extending a firm handshake, "have a seat. I understand you're here about a divorce?" Chris sat down, nodding curtly. "That's right," he said, his voice steady but tinged with bitterness. "My wife cheated on me, and I want to make sure she doesn't walk away with anything." Caldwell leaned back in his chair, studying Chris intently. "Adultery is a serious claim," he said, his tone professional but direct. "Do you have evidence to back it up?" Chris didn't hesitate. He pulled out his phone, his movements purposeful, and opened the folder he had created the night before. "Plenty," he said, handing the phone to Caldwell. "Texts, photos, even a few videos." Caldwell took the phone and began scrolling through the files, his expression remaining neutral as he examined the evidence. The minutes ticked by, the silence in the room punctuated only by the faint clicks of the phone screen. Finally, Caldwell set the phone down and met Chris's gaze. "This is solid," Caldwell said with a nod. "The messages alone paint a very clear picture of infidelity. Combined with the photos and videos, this will go a long way in court." Chris exhaled, a small sense of relief washing over him. For the first time since discovering the betrayal, he felt like he had a measure of control over the situation. "Good," he said firmly. "I've worked too hard to let her walk away with what's mine. I want the house, the savings, everything. She doesn't deserve a dime." Caldwell raised a hand, his tone measured. "I understand where you're coming from, but the court will take other factors into account. However, with this evidence, we have leverage. It will strengthen your case considerably." Chris nodded, his jaw tightening. "I don't care what it takes. I just want to make sure she doesn't get away with this." Caldwell gave a small, reassuring smile. "Leave it to me. We'll make sure the court sees the full picture. Adultery is hard to dispute when the evidence is this concrete." Caldwell sighed. As Chris left the office, his steps felt a little steadier. There was still pain, anger, and betrayal simmering beneath the surface. But now, he had a plan. For the first time in days, he felt like he was moving toward resolution, toward reclaiming the life Lisa had shattered. In the back room, he helped worse to fix the body. Chris wasn't done. The betrayal he endured had left him simmering, and while his focus remained on the divorce, a part of him couldn't let Ryan walk away unscathed. The man had not only crossed a line, but done so brazenly, and Chris was determined to expose him for what he truly was. One evening, Chris returned to McKinley's, the bar where the ordeal had begun. He entered quietly, blending into the crowd. He wasn't there to confront anyone. This time, he came prepared, with a different strategy. He found a corner table that provided a clear view of the bar and waited, nursing a drink while observing the room. It didn't take long for Ryan to appear. The man strutted in with the same overconfidence that Chris now despised, Ryan immediately began chatting up a group of women near the bar, his tone dripping with charm that was anything but subtle. Chris noted how his hand lingered on a woman's shoulder, how his laugh carried just a bit too loudly, and how he leaned in closer than necessary during their conversation. Chris discreetly pulled out his phone, angling it to capture the scene without drawing attention. He started recording, his camera following Ryan's every move. Ryan's behavior left little to the imagination. He flirted shamelessly, bought drinks, and even scribbled his number on a napkin for one of the women. Chris captured it all, the sly winks, the casual touches, and the smirks that Ryan likely thought made him irresistible. Over the next few nights, Chris repeated this process, visiting the bar on evenings he knew Ryan would be there. Each time, Ryan didn't disappoint, giving Chris plenty of material. It was clear this wasn't a one-time occurrence. Ryan's actions were habitual, and his arrogance made him careless. Once Chris had gathered enough footage, he began compiling it into a series of videos. He made sure the evidence was clear and undeniable, each clip showing Ryan in compromising situations that would be impossible to explain away. Satisfied with his work, Chris created anonymous accounts and sent the videos to Ryan's acquaintances, including some of his co-workers and family members. He didn't include a message. He didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. Ryan's charm had finally been exposed for what it was, a facade masking a manipulative, selfish individual. Chris didn't wait for a reaction or seek out confirmation of the fallout. He didn't need to see the aftermath to feel the satisfaction of knowing the truth was out there. Ryan had underestimated him. But now, everyone would see the man for who he truly was. For Chris, it was one step closer to reclaiming his dignity. The courtroom was silent, save for the occasional rustle of papers or the soft murmur of a whispered conversation. Chris sat at the petitioner's table, his back straight, his expression resolute. The weeks leading up to this moment had been grueling, but now, with everything laid bare, he felt a sense of purpose. He glanced at Lisa, seated across from him. Her face was pale, her eyes red from tears shed earlier in the day. She avoided his gaze, fidgeting with the edge of her blouse as the tension in the room hung heavy. Nathan Caldwell stood confidently as he addressed the court, presenting the mountain of evidence Chris had provided. The texts, photos, and videos illuminated the depth of Lisa's betrayal, painting a picture that left little room for defense. The judge listened intently, her expression neutral, but her eyes sharp as she reviewed the damning material. Chris remained calm, though his heart pounded as the proceedings unfolded. Lisa's lawyer attempted to mitigate the damage, framing her actions as mistakes born of emotional turmoil. But the evidence was irrefutable. Every text, every time-stamped photo, every exchange between Lisa and Ryan told a story of deliberate deception, not a fleeting lapse in judgment. When the judge finally spoke, her voice was steady and authoritative. The evidence clearly supports the claim of marital infidelity. As such, the petitioner's request to retain full ownership of shared assets is granted. The respondent will retain only her personal belongings. This court finds in favor of Mr. Carter. A sense of relief washed over Chris, though it was tempered by the weight of what had brought him to this point. The betrayal had cost him his marriage, his trust, and parts of himself he wasn't sure he'd ever get back. But at least, in this small way, justice had been served. As the proceedings wrapped up, Lisa finally met his gaze. Her expression was a mix of regret and disbelief, her lips trembling, as if searching for the right words to say. But before she could speak, Chris leaned forward slightly, his voice low but firm. "Don't you dare try to blame this on me," he said, his tone steady but cold. "You made your choices." Lisa's eyes welled up again, but Chris didn't waver. He stood, gathering his papers and nodding briefly to Caldwell, who gave him a small, reassuring smile. Chris walked out of the courtroom without looking back, the echo of his footsteps marking the beginning of his next chapter. He didn't feel triumphant, only resolute. This was the closure he needed to move forward. The courthouse steps were quiet as Chris descended them, his mind heavy with the events of the day. The ruling had been definitive, the evidence overwhelming. It was over, or so he thought. Just as he reached the parking lot, he heard the sound of hurried footsteps behind him. He didn't need to turn around to know it was Lisa. "Chris, wait!" Her voice broke, thick with desperation. He stopped but didn't turn, his shoulders stiff as he waited for her to catch up. When she reached him, Lisa was already crying, her face red and streaked with tears. "Chris, please," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to talk to you." Chris turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "What is it, Lisa?" he asked flatly, his tone devoid of warmth. She stepped closer, clutching her hands to her chest as if trying to hold herself together. "Chris, I'm sorry for everything," she sobbed. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But please, just give me another chance. We can fix this." Chris looked at her, his gaze steady but distant. Her words barely moved him. They felt hollow, too little and far too late. He waited for her to finish, his silence unnerving her further. "Chris, I love you," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know what I was thinking, but it didn't mean anything. I can't lose you, please." He took a deep breath, his jaw tightening as he spoke, his voice firm and unwavering. "You made your bed, Lisa. Now you get to lie in it." Her sobs grew louder, but Chris didn't flinch. He had already given her every opportunity to explain, every chance to make amends, and she had squandered them. The woman standing before him now was a stranger, and no amount of pleading could undo the damage she had caused. Lisa reached out to him, her fingers brushing his sleeve, but he stepped back, putting space between them. "It's over, Lisa," he said simply. "Go live your life, and I'll live mine." Without waiting for a response, Chris turned and walked away, his steps deliberate and steady. He didn't look back, not once. Each step felt like a small weight lifting from his shoulders, the chains of betrayal and heartbreak loosening their hold. As he drove home, the emotions churned inside him. Anger, sadness, and oddly, a sense of relief. The journey hadn't been easy, but he had fought for himself, for his dignity, and for a fresh start. Exposing Ryan and holding Lisa accountable had brought a sense of closure he hadn't thought possible. Though the scars of betrayal would remain, Chris knew he was finally free. The road ahead might be uncertain, but it was his to walk, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he could take the first step forward.